You should expect that if you hire someone, they will generally know how to do search engine optimization, but they may not know the keywords that are most economically advantageous for you, that are the low-hanging fruit in your market. Understand how your market ultimately buys traction online, who are your biggest competitors, things like that oftentimes are within the knowledge base and wheelhouse of an agency, or at least they should be, of the agency that you choose to work with. So you have to compare all of those expenses, not just here's what I'm paying Susie the marketer versus here's what I'm paying monthly to agency, because oftentimes the value that you get from an employee is a longer term investment. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Crushing Chaos with Law Firm Mentor podcast, where on today's episode, we are going to talk about when to bring your marketing in-house. So one of the things that I hear a lot from law firm owners, every time we talk about this topic, it seems to always veer into the challenge with working with outside agencies. And a lot of people recognize that there's a lot of value to be found with the right digital marketing agency, but a very common thread that unfortunately most of us will or have experienced in the course of running a law firm is that you sign them up, you're thrilled for the first few months, everything's going well, you're starting to get traction, and then all of a sudden you just kind of fall off a cliff. Sometimes a campaign has been set and forgotten. They set it and forget it. Sometimes the problem becomes that they start growing. That's a very common one, right? Because people that know how to market know how to attract business. And so if they're attracting business for you, they know how to attract it for themselves. And the next thing you know, they have grown so quickly that they have to staff up very quickly. And sometimes that is not the easiest thing. We also know that as business owners, right? So what ends up happening is 7 or 8 times the number of folks that they were servicing suddenly become the responsibility of your primary person, and you don't get service anymore. And oftentimes it's just one of those chronic challenges that as we grow as business owners, our needs grow and shift and evolve. And sometimes you could have a very responsive digital marketing company that could be doing a great job for you, but they're just not meeting the needs of where you're growing to and where you're going to because you have changed and there's a disconnect, right? So they haven't necessarily been a part of all those conversations about how you're shifting the brand and about how you want to attract different customers and perhaps even how your messaging needs to change as you might be adding different practice areas or taking some things away. So there's a lot of different reasons why outside agencies might not forever be your solution. They are oftentimes the most economical and the most pragmatic solution when you first start digital marketing, but a lot of times they are not the end all solution. So the question becomes, how do you know when to, instead of having an outside agency, hire someone in-house who can do a lot of the nuts and bolts or even some of the more creative, innovative things for your company, for your law firm. And so that's going to be what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the 5 areas that you need to consider and have an answer for. So I'm going to give you a question that you need to ask that you need to be prepared to answer in order to evaluate whether you should keep your outside digital marketing agency or bring your marketing in-house in your law firm. All right, so let's dive in. So the very first consideration, okay, one of 5. First consideration is always cost versus value, right? Now, you guys know I am not a big fan of talking about cost from the perspective of expense. Marketing is an investment. So you're always going to be evaluating the return on any investment and every investment that you make in your law firm. But when we say cost versus value, what we're really talking about is bottom line, what is the cost for you acquiring the talent, the skill, the knowledge that you're getting from a digital marketing agency? And you have to weigh that against the talent, the skill, and what you would receive from an in-house person. Now, the challenge with doing that off the rip is that oftentimes it is really challenging to find an in-house person who has the same compositive skills that you can outsource. And a lot of times we are outsourcing more than one thing, right? So you might have an agency that is dealing with your search engine optimization, your SEO, your pay-per-click marketing, your PPC. And then you might have a different agency that's dealing with your reviews, and they might be marketing your online reviews. You could have yet another agency, or maybe a third party, like maybe somebody that you hire through Fiverr or People Per Hour, or one of those platforms that is doing things like for you a la carte basis, like maybe landing pages, or if you have content marketing, maybe they are writing ebooks for you, or perhaps white papers, things that you're getting people into your funnel with through your email marketing list, right? Those strategies oftentimes require a certain level of expertise, and not every person is going to have all those areas of expertise. In fact, one of the reasons why a lot of folks like working with agencies is that even though you might not have one person to do all of those activities in an agency, you oftentimes can find an agency that has all of those different divisions of its company that can help you. So they will have an email marketing division. They will have a PPC division and so forth. But you have to think about it from the perspective of cost versus value, right? When you're just looking at an agency, you have to think about the management fee for all those different services. And then, of course, if you're doing paid advertising, you have to think about the actual dollars that you're paying. So if you're doing Google PPC, you're going to be paying Google, right? You're going to have to pay Google, whether you pay Google through a management agency or a marketing agency, or you pay Google through an employee. But for an employee, you're going to have additional costs that you don't have through an agency, right? So you're going to have salary, but you're also going to have benefits. You're going to have bonuses. You're going to have other incentives that you might design into the role for performance. And so you have to think about the comp structure of both of those options, right? To figure out which option is going to get you the most value for what you are spending. And with an employee, the other thing you have to consider is that you have some additional areas of opportunity with an employee that you don't have with an agency. We're going to cover those in a little bit. But just in the cost versus value, you have to think about with an employee, you are going to have some training costs. So you should expect that if you hire someone, they will generally know how to do search engine optimization, but they may not know the keywords that are most economically advantageous for you, that are the low-hanging fruit. They may not know in your market, right? Understand how your market ultimately buys, attraction online, who are your biggest competitors, things like that oftentimes are within the knowledge base and wheelhouse of an agency, or at least they should be, of the agency that you choose to work with. So you have to compare all of those expenses, not just here's what I'm paying Susie the marketer versus here's what I'm paying monthly to agency, because oftentimes the value that you get from an employee is a longer term investment. And so there's some upfront costs that you have to weigh comparative to what you will spend for a marketing agency. So the question that you have to ask here is, what is the likely return on my investment? And what is my out-of-pocket cost for each option? Okay. And then you just compare the two. And it might not be that the answer is, I can't afford in-house person. Maybe you can afford in-house person just like you can afford digital marketing agency. But it might be a question of when you're going to get that return, because spending right now versus spending right now to get something right now happens in both, digital marketing agency and an individual. But spending right now for a longer term investment has different metrics the farther out you go when you are comparing those two. And you really have to do that math. All right. Factor number 2. Okay. We've talked about cost versus value. The second thing you have to think about is control and alignment with your firm culture. Now, this is one that I think is in the back of the minds of most law firm owners by the time that they are hiring a digital marketing agency or an individual, but it might not be fleshed out in quite the way that we're going to talk about today. So you have to consider that agencies are always juggling multiple clients, right? Just like you as a lawyer don't have one single client. At least you shouldn't. That's very risky, right? You are typically going to be servicing multiple clients. So will your agency. But in that, the economies of scale that you get of having some agency that's able to batch content, that's able to get things on a system. And in my experience, marketing agencies are pretty good at that. That's something that you can usually expect a cadence is going to be established with your digital marketing agency. what you lose oftentimes is brand voice, right? Because they are learning you to be able to get you scale, but they're learning you at the time that you onboard. They're not necessarily in a state of continuous learning the way an employee is. And that's not necessarily because you aren't training them or even because they're not asking, but there is a certain level of culture that comes into one's knowledge just from being in the environment, right? You start to hear how we talk about our law firm differently if you are boots on the grounds there every day, talking to the lawyers, talking to the team members, talking to clients. And that's not the same experience for an agency because you are one of many. And oftentimes the voice is a smaller part of the marketing focus, unless you hire purely branding agency. Most marketers that you're hiring at the agency level, you're typically saying, get me some clients, get me results right now, right? So it's not about necessarily how you show up to the public in the short term and long term. It's really about how you can cultivate leads and how you can convert leads. So you have to think about the fact that brand voice is not the primary driver, and it doesn't necessarily seep in because they're not interacting with you in the same way an employee is. Now, having said that, an in-house marketer has access to the firm culture in a more qualitative way. And they also get to tailor messaging for the clients that you desire in a way that is slightly different than an agency does, right? You should be talking to your marketing agency, whether it's an agency or an individual. You should be talking to your marketers about who you want to serve and what you want to say about yourself. They should help you to cultivate your message about yourself so that you can attract the folks that you want. But someone that's in-house has the benefit of having typically access to more assets, right? And not just assets like your newsletter or your website copy, right? Someone can be handed that, but they have access to more assets in terms of your team and your clients because, again, as an employee, they are in the throes of your business. And so in that sense, you oftentimes get a stronger learning of brand voice. And as it shifts, if you have a good employee and you are systematizing what is being said to whom and for what purpose, you should have a greater access to that shift happening over time with your employee. So you want to think about this question, and this is the key when you are evaluating alignment with culture. You want to ask yourself, how much effort do you need to invest in ensuring that your brand is deeply connected to your firm's personality? And that's a question that you have to ask when you are evaluating which is the better hire, because you will have to invest time in educating either a marketing agency or an in-house person about the who and how of what you are and what you're serving. But how you do that is going to focus a little bit differently for an agency versus an individual. All right, we're talking about number 3 now. Okay, so number 3 of 5, the consideration that you have to think about when you're determining whether to stay with an outside agency or bring it in-house is speed and responsiveness. Now, this is about agility, okay? In a law firm, especially a law firm that is under, say, $10 million, you have a competitive advantage against larger law firms that oftentimes does not get enough attention. And that is the ability to pivot and the ability to jump on opportunities at a much more rapid pace. So big law has dollars at its disposal. That is something that it has as a benefit, right? At some point, you get the economies of scale. And every time you add a lawyer, it's a simple mathematical calculation. I'm adding a lawyer, but my rent is not going up. I'm adding a lawyer, but my licenses are not going up. You might have some software licenses, but maybe your big scale copiers, costs are not going up. Your cost of goods sold, if you will, is not going up. But you have to figure that out. And once you figure that out, when you stack bodies, the more bodies you stack in a law firm, the more profit you make, right? So at some point, you start adding bodies and it's purely profit. I mean, you have to pay the person, but you're probably paying the person out of revenue that you already have in streams from other employees. So that person can be purely profit. And you don't have that in a small law firm because you don't have enough people where the economies of scale make the math such that every new person can just be more dollars in the bank. So with that, you have to think about what your competitive advantage is. And as a small law firm, that competitive advantage is agility. You can move faster. You can hop on things, right? In fact, we have looked at law firms being some of the top businesses that are jumping on the AI wave. And I call it a wave, but I do think it is here to stay. I think it's a major part of our future. But we're jumping on that. We are not laggards in that. And some of the fastest adopters have been at small law firms. Because while big law has to and is making moves to buy and hire out the role of creating its own tech and creating its own AI generative platforms, small law, right? Solo owners, smaller law firms have the ability to start learning it right now. And there's far less resistance to learning it right now because we have seen how technology really allows us to run alongside the big firms. Well, what does that mean for us in the context of this conversation? So the first thing is that agencies tend to work on timelines. As I said before, one of the things that I have found to be almost universally the case, I've never worked with an agency that does not have this dialed in, is that they know how to batch content, right? Your day of the week that they're going to talk to you is Tuesday, or your meeting of the month is every third Thursday of the month. And then they have a certain deliverable schedule. And it's loaded into their platform so that they can deliver to you whatever the content deliverables are by a date certain. And the things that tend to get in the way of that are, frankly, us, right? If the lawyer doesn't review it timely enough, or if the lawyer doesn't give the content on which that content marketing is going to be based, they don't give it to you, to the marketer timely enough, then the content doesn't get created. But generally speaking, they're pretty good at that. Okay. And that means that they have a system for who's doing what when in their company, and you are a client. Now, the difficulty with that is that if something pops up, if you just see something, it's a great opportunity for your law firm. You know that there's a great opportunity to scale with that opportunity you want to seize. It is really hard to get your agency to still deliver at whatever cadence you've agreed upon, but be able to by the way, that sound was hitting the brakes. Okay. Stop what you're doing midstream and pivot and jump into the next thing. It is really challenging for agencies to do that because, again, they are serving a multitude of clients and they're serving them on a cadence. And it is oftentimes that you are fit into a model. And as soon as you ask to do something outside that model, you frustrate their workflow. And sometimes they're willing to go along with it. You know, they're willing to talk to you and say, okay, I know you really want to do X. Let's see what we can do about that. But sometimes they can't, right? Sometimes they just don't have the manpower. Sometimes, as I said before, they're in a growth spurt. So they're stacking bodies. So they just can't add more hours to whatever is the load of the person that's servicing you. So you lose out, right? Or they say we can do that, 3 weeks from Thursday, right? They just can't instantaneously do. But somebody who is in-house, you get to set the priorities. You get to say, I know we're going to be doing X, Y, and Z. However, you've got to fit this in. And it can be an incentive based to add on, right? Depending on how you choose to work in your law firm, you can absolutely have an agreement with your marketing person that, hey, look, the incentive, we're going to jump on this opportunity over here. The incentive is for you. When we generate X number of clients, you're going to get a bonus, or, we're going to restructure your comp or something like that, right? You have the ability to add more to their plate, but sometimes it's just a matter of reshuffling their plate, right? You don't want to work your employee into the ground. You want them to still work however many hours you're paying them to work, but you also want them to have this as a higher priority than whatever is on their plate. And the beautiful thing about that is if they are in-house, the ability to shift could be a function of outsourcing a project that's on their plate, or it could be a function of going out and getting someone who can very quickly jump on it. But that's less likely to happen with an agency. So you have to be aware of what the resources are of your agency and or of your in-house person when you are comparing the two. And it's challenging to do that because you haven't yet hired the in-house person, right? You're deciding whether you should or not. So it might not be as pragmatic for you to say, here's what the project is that I want them to jump on. You have to give it a little bit of qualitative assessment, right? It has to be a global understanding of how often do we have things that we just want to go in the direction of, and how quickly could someone who's in-house pivot versus an agency. And that obviously would be something that you would explore in your interview process, but just knowing going in that you have to explore that, I think is very valuable. So the question here is, how likely am I to need to pivot? And in this day and age, I think the answer is very likely, just because we are in a sea of change. I want to call it a tech boom, but it's not even a tech boom, right? Artificial intelligence, I think, is a sea change in the way that we will live our lives as humans, right? So when you think about that, that's a pretty big pivot, but there are pivots within those pivots. And how likely are you to need to pivot quickly? And compound question, how able is your agency to be able to do that relative to an in-house person? Okay. Item number 4. Okay. We have covered so far. We are talking about the top 5 areas that you need to probe to decide whether or not to bring your marketing in-house. And we've talked about cost versus value. We have talked about control and alignment with firm culture. We've talked about speed and responsiveness. And now we are going to talk about depth of expertise versus breadth of skills. Okay. Depth of expertise versus breadth of skills. So when we talk about skill set, the thing to remember is that agencies oftentimes will have teams of specialists, and that can be a great benefit and a very cost-effective way of getting a lot of service in a lot of different areas without having to go out and hire a bunch of different people, right? So you have your SEO person, your PPC person, your content person, your email newsletter person, right? All those different areas. And oftentimes you'll have an overarching person who looks at analytics. Now, this is what I will tell you, and we've talked about this before, that marketers tend to fall in one of two categories. You tend to have a marketer who, and by the way, by marketers, I'm talking about people who go out and get degrees in marketing, who study marketing as their career. You tend to fit into one or two categories. You get the person that has the big, sexy ideas. They are very creative, very innovative. They can pull together the most sexy graphics. They can come up with the punchiest slogans. They are the person who is the creative explosion in the room, right? These are the people that show up to conferences with pink hair, right? These are the people who oftentimes have the coolest tattoos, right? Think about a person that you see and you're like, wow, that's a person I'd love to have a beer with, right? That's what we think of when we think of the creative set. But marketing is that, but it is also the intellectual set, right? The intellectual marketer is the person who dives deep in the data. These are the people who have an account on SEMrush, right? And for those of you that are not familiar with SEMrush, it's SEMrush, and it is a program that allows you to look at how you are ultimately performing in your keywords, backlinks, etc., relative to your competitors, right? So there are the people that are digging in there and saying, okay, where are we getting traction? Where are we not? And what are our hypotheses about this? They are the people that are going to go into your CRM and look at your entire marketing funnels and see how each one is performing relative to each other. They're calculating conversion rates on your landing pages on a regular basis, right? They're always looking for the needle in the haystack within the needle within the haystack. They're trying to figure out the why of things, right? They are the analytics folks. Rarely do you have a highly creative, sexy graphic person in the mind of and in the body of the highly analytical name, rank, serial number person, right? They're just not the same person. And with an agency, you oftentimes get both, right? You get the people who are on the front lines doing the work. They're helping you come up with the ideas. They're helping you shift your brand. They're helping you change your colors. They're helping you decide what fonts. And at the same time, you also have a different human who is looking at the numbers, evaluating the campaigns, looking at the spend. And you get both of those in one entity with an agency. With an individual, you're typically going to have to choose. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to go without, right? If you choose someone who is highly creative and innovative, that does not mean you go without the analytics. That means that job is outsourced or that job is handled by someone else. Could be your office administrator who is handling your analytics in your marketing, right? They could be working side by side. But oftentimes you have to get somebody, especially when you first hire, when you bring that person in-house, you have to get someone who can do both, who can accomplish both. And some of that is outsourcing, right? So you could outsource the sexy creative stuff and keep the analytics within the human that you've hired. Or you might have to outsource a bit of both, because depending on the level of expertise that you hire, you could need more support in both of those areas. But when you think about expertise, you have to evaluate what is the person that I'm going to hire able to do and able to accomplish. And that does include whatever budget you're going to allocate for their being able to outsource. So some of it may be that the person can't do it on their own, but it may very well be that they can get it done, right? They don't have to be the doer, but they have to get it done. So here is the question that you have to ask when we talk about expertise and breadth of skills, okay? You're going to have to ask, do you need a full orchestra of skills or a soloist who knows your audience better than anyone? Okay. If you get that soloist who knows your audience better than anyone, they can go hire your outsourced people to do some project work for you. And oftentimes you're able to target very succinctly exactly what you need. So you're not doing a blitz ring, right? You're having somebody who's doing the analytics and saying, okay, this is when we get the greatest open rate on our email newsletters. We need more specification there. We need to dial that in more. We're getting traction there. We want to lean into that, or we're not getting any traction here at all. We're going to tweak and A/B test until we do, or we're going to junk it and do what works in other areas. Okay. So it's very important that you consider that the person that you consider hiring has to be able to fit that. And you need to have a mold for what that person's role is going to be even before you hire them. All right. Fifth and final area that you should probe when you are determining whether or not to bring your marketing in-house. And this is your scalability and your growth trajectory. If you are in growth mode, you have to be very careful with marketing, because marketing can be the area that will completely sink the ship when you are in growth mode. What a lot of lawyers tend to do is they start to see traction and then they say, okay, great. When I spend $3,000 a month, look at all of the clients that I have. So now I'm just going to double it. I'll just spend $6,000 a month. And that feels like the right thing to do, because it's like, okay, once we see what's working, let's just pour some gasoline on the fire and let's just ramp it up, right? Let's blow it up. Well, here's the problem with that. Oftentimes, there is an upper limit to what you can achieve through various different digital marketing strategies. And if you have a economic system with your marketing agency, if their management fee goes up based on the dollar amount that you're spending, it's in their interest that you spend more, even if your marketplace is not going to get you more, right? So let's assume you're dealing with a high integrity marketer, and I think that most of them are. I'm not going to say all of them are, but I do believe that there are a lot of high integrity marketers out there. Let's say you got somebody, they're going to tell you, hey, look, you're not going to get more traction by trying to buy more here. But they're still going to want you to be, investing in other strategies. If you think about it, when you are growing, there are so many levers to pull and there are so many things to invest in, right? You are investing in people, right? So you tend to, especially when you start getting, in the multi-millions, like the low multi-millions. So when you get to like 2 to 3 million, that's where you're really starting to invest in humans, right? You're bringing in high level thinkers. You are bringing in COOs and CFOs and CMOs. You're paying for higher value folks in the legal ranks. So lawyers and paralegals who have a lot more experience, who can command a higher salary, right? So you're spending more, and then you're doing a lot with technology, because that's the world we're in now. So you're doing a lot of your infrastructure there. And the economies of scale, at some point, your margins start to go down. A whole lot of folks, that's when they decide to stop growing. Oh my God, my margins. You have to recognize that you have to compress to be able to expand, right? There is something about, pulling back to spring forward. Think about it in that way, like a bow and arrow. But a whole lot of folks can't deal with the fear that comes when those margins start compressing. The only thing that will get you through that so that you can keep growing is to understand your numbers in a way that says, this is a strategic investment. So I'm going to pour more in right now. My margins are going to go down, but I'm going to get more out on the other side. So that's a calculation, right? That's a very linear path, right? It's a mathematical equation. The problem is not that the math doesn't exist, it's that a lot of people only apply the math in one area, right? If my cost per click is X dollars, then I'll spend Y dollars and get Z results. Well, here's the problem. People are far less mathematical than things like digital marketing, right? It'd be great if you could hire somebody and say, all right, I'm going to spend $200,000 on a salary and I'm going to get Y result. And you may or you may not. You may get there in the short run, you may not get there at all, or it might take longer. And so you have to get better at strategically evaluating every investment that you make, not just in your marketing. But what a lot of folks will do is that because they are in scale mode, they just pour into marketing. And then when marketing doesn't work in the way that they expect it to work, then they say, I just pissed away all this money. I just wasted my time. I just compressed my margins. Growing is not worth it, right? Because of the fear that engenders. So I just want you to think about it from that perspective, right? Smaller firms do benefit from agencies, but only until the marketing spend justifies a dedicated hire, right? At some point, you lose the opportunity that is available to you through the agency, because the agency is, again, only seeing a piece of the puzzle. They're only seeing what they're doing. They're not seeing how the digital marketing strategy is supported by the brand strategy, which may be a longer term strategy, right? They're not seeing how bringing in certain strategic hires allows you to do cross marketing. If you have different departments in your law firm, it allows you to be able to market the humans that are in your law firm. And a lot of folks shy away from marketing their teams. They say, I want to be the star because my team may leave me. But here's the problem. If you have to market yourself and only yourself, then you as a figurehead can bring folks in, but there's only going to be so much that you personally can do, because lawyers receive referrals from clients, right? So if you're not doing all the lawyering, you should expect that your lawyers are going to generate clients. And when they generate clients, that does mean that those clients can leave with them when they go. And you have to expect that they will go, right? You have to expect that no matter how great you pay, no matter how great your work environment, sometimes people just get antsy and want to move on. There's a whole field of communications out there that tells people the only way you're going to advance in your career is to move around every so often. And there is an energy of disloyalty that is just now kind of baked into the way we do business in general. And that's okay, right? Just as people get to prioritize their own interests, so do you. But I don't say that to scare you away from hiring. I say that so that you consider that you should be doing everything that you can to get the most out of the people that you employ while they're in your employ. And that means growing them so that if they do leave, they're great for your profession. But while they are here, they are generating for your law firm. And that's also a very viable way of growing, which is harder to accomplish when you have an outsourced agency, because their focus is getting new, not necessarily feeding new off of the old, if that makes sense. Okay. So in the area of scalability, this is what you have to ask. You should ask, at what revenue threshold does marketing stop being a vendor function and become a core business function? When marketing is a core business function, meaning your marketing team is meeting with your sales team and you are ultimately creating a certain economic budget for both marketing and for sales, right? What has to come in and what has to go out in both of those areas. Then you start thinking about it as the marketing department becomes its own autonomous agency, right? Within your business, you need it to function at a certain level in order to produce for you what's needed for you to make the number of sales that it must produce in order to have the requisite revenue for running your law firm. Okay. And each of those divisions is going to have to run in synchronicity with each other. And it's, again, much easier to do that when you have an individual versus an agency. All right, everyone. Today we have been talking about the 5 areas that you need to probe to determine whether or not to bring your marketing in-house. I am Allison Williams, host of the Crushing Chaos with Law Firm Mentor podcast, and I will see you on our next episode.